A few days ago, I reached out to the Halo community on Twitter to ask what weapon, from a spectator standpoint, viewers would enjoy watching come Halo Infinite. By unanimous decision, majority of the votes was for the battle rifle over the new sidekick weapon. This question definitely got the ideas rolling in my head, and there were even a few pros that joined in on the conversation as to what they would prefer in competitive settings. So in today's video, I'm going to go over some key aspects that could determine which of the two weapons would be best for Halo Infinite's multiplayer, specifically competitive play. Nostalgia. Let's face it, everybody loves the battle rifle. It is one of the most iconic weapons in all of Halo's history, and it makes sense that players and spectators would want to see the beloved weapon back in Halo's competitive settings, considering it was the weapon that was used during Halo's prime in Halo 2 and Halo 3. It has an identity to it in the sense that no matter what game community you come from, when you see a BR, you know it's Halo. With that being said, however, just like I said in my video explaining map remakes, I think making executive gameplay decisions based on only catering to people's nostalgia is not a great practice. Way too often, games will implement weapons or maps based off nostalgia into newer iterations of their games in the franchise, but it never really translates well because of just how drastically different the sandbox is from previous iterations. The perfect example of this is the battle rifle in Halo 5. With Halo 5 being hit scan and the bullet magnetism being excessively high, the Halo 5 BR felt like a laser beam and it was severely overpowered in vanilla settings. But we will go into this topic a little later in this video. And sometimes these weapons are reintroduced into a game sandbox with tweaks made in order so that it is more balanced to fit in with the other weapons in the game. I don't know if many of you remember, but with Halo 4's vanilla settings, the battle rifle was actually a 5-shot weapon. And although it fit the game's existing sandbox, it did it at the expense of the identity of the battle rifle. Fans, myself included, felt like it was almost disrespectful to change that iconic 4-shot time to kill that the battle rifle was always known to have. Similarly, you can't just reintroduce something like the CE Magnum into one of the newer Halo games, but take away the 3-shot capability of the weapon. It is one of the defining traits of the Magnum that should never ever be changed. I know everyone loves the battle rifle, and I too would love to see it return fully to its former glory, but I also understand that game balance is important when it comes to comp play. As long as 343 have created the arena sandbox and maps with the battle rifle as a starting weapon in mind, and the weapon wasn't just thrown in there for nostalgia, then I think we'll be okay. The most ideal situation would be that the developers would be able to find a way to create a balance with the weapon while still maintaining the identity that the BR has always been known to have. Burst versus semi-automatic weapons. The most notable difference between the battle rifle and the sidekick Magnum is the firing mode. The battle rifle is a 3-round burst weapon where the sidekick is a semi-automatic single-fire weapon. On the surface, it may not seem like that significant of a deal, but there is so much depth and detail that must be taken into account. The different firing modes ultimately draw out unique and specific skills out of each player. Typically speaking, the Halo battle rifle can kill an enemy if all 4 bursts of the weapon connect with the player. That means you have to land 12 individual bullets onto the enemy. For this reason, not only with just Halo, but with any game for that matter, burst weapons favor players who have steady aim and reward those who are able to keep their reticle on the opponent for the entirety of the exchange. Whereas with the sidekick and other single-fire weapons, players are rewarded for mastering mechanics like quick flicks and precise aiming. You are more encouraged to focus on movement and strafing to throw enemies' crosshairs off while popping in a shot in between the maneuvering. So some of you may be wondering why it's worth mentioning the required skill set for each of the weapons, while some of you may have already caught on to what I'm getting at. When evaluating these different skill sets, one must also factor in the input method that the player is using. That's right, it comes down to the whole debate of mouse and keyboard versus controller. As mentioned earlier, when it comes to burst weapons, players who manage to keep their reticle on an opponent will usually come out on top in a battle exchange, and with controllers, usually they have an easier time doing so in closer ranges with the inclusion of aim assist. Whereas with single shot weapons, mouse and keyboard players usually have an easier time utilizing more of the movement options they have, all while getting in quick flicks. Going back to the nostalgia standpoint real quickly, of course there are many old school fans, myself included, that would love to see the return of the battle rifle as the primary weapon, but what must be understood and what Halo has always stood for is balanced equal starts. One of the largest concerns with MCC being launched on PC was the disparity and unfairness mouse and keyboard players felt against controller players because of the large amount of aim assist that was given to those controller players.
It just felt like they were unwinnable battles. I couldn't put them any other way. It wasn't about me getting shot from certain angles. It wasn't about me not knowing angles. It wasn't about like Halo as the overall game in itself. It was about just the strictly you guys, you are on one side of the room, and there's another guy on the other side of the room, and there's no obstacles, there's no flags, there's no anything. It's just two guys with battle rifles fighting, and I think that I just can't win against a controller consistent enough for me to really take it seriously to play it. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Classic and legacy Halo games were made with controller as the main input method in mind, and even in other AAA titles like Apex and Fortnite, many pro players complain of the aim assist tuning that is given to players on console. And now with Halo Infinite being free to play and easily accessible through multiple platforms, you can bet that there will be a large PC mouse and keyboard player base at launch. And in order to retain that population and keep the state of the game healthy, it's important that these new players to the franchise aren't ignored. And for that reason, many of the players might prefer the semi-automatic sidekick as a starting weapon to respect and maintain the competitive integrity. Ideally though, I hope 343 can find that balance and middle ground to make it so that both controller and mouse and keyboard feel balanced, and they can coexist to a point where input device does not have any significant advantage over the other. The last factor I want to address in this video is the netcode of the game. Although for competitive tournaments, matches should be played in a LAN environment, it's still important online play is able to maintain that competitive integrity. The Halo competitive scene was arguably at its peak during the Halo 3 era. But if you ask any of the pros who competed during that time, I think it is unanimously agreed upon that they had more of an unpleasant experience. During the 360 days, everything was host-based, no dedicated servers. In addition to that, Halo 3 adopted a projectile bullet registration system. There were moments where bullets would not register due to that mechanic. And in my previous video, I had mentioned that Halo 2 adopted a hit scan system, but since then I have been corrected. I learned that even Halo 2 had adopted a projectile-based system, but the only difference is that Halo 2's bullet velocity was significantly higher than that of Halo 3's, to the point where you usually would not even notice the bullet travel time in traditional 4v4 arena maps in Halo 2. However, in certain BTB maps, players were then encouraged to lead their shots slightly. Because of that, it is really hard to determine how the BR would operate in Halo Infinite alongside with the sidekick, given that it was confirmed that Halo Infinite will utilize a hit scan registration system. Halo 4 did indeed adopt a hit scan registration system, but let's not talk about the competitive scene for that. It's best we leave that in the past. Halo 5, on the other hand, showed potential for Halo esports were it to have a Magnum as a starting weapon. Although at first many were reluctant to accept that the BR had been replaced by the Magnum, pros and the casual community slowly began to realize just how versatile the Magnum was and how well it worked with Halo 5 sandbox. Whereas the battle rifle in vanilla Halo 5 was more so treated as a map pickup weapon. The main issue with Halo 5 shooting was that there was heavy bullet magnetism. Essentially, players would have their reticle way off center from the enemy, but their shots would still connect.
Now, if we turn on the debug stuff here, you'll see a ton of different circles here. This little cross here that you see is actually where the bullets will bend towards, where your aim is actually corrected to. And as I go over him, you'll see it actually snaps to him. It kind of gets back to the center of my actual reticle.
This, paired with the hitscan BR, felt like players were shooting their enemies with lasers cross maps and thus felt like the weapon was way too overpowered. Having more fine-tuned aim was not rewarded as opposed to how the Magnum had operated. And in an attempt to try and balance the weapon, the BR was nerfed to a point where it's almost unusable. Players would avoid from even picking up the weapon. And I feel like these nerfs were made due to the limitations that the netcode presented. As for how Halo Infinite's netcode will be, we still have no idea. Depending on how it operates will make it easier to determine whether the BR or the Magnum is better suited for comp. But regardless of what weapon is chosen, it is important that issues like bullet magnetism and heavy aim are addressed. And that is all I have for today. In short, I am on the party for having the BR return as the primary weapon for competitive play. I am a classic Halo fan, and it would fill my heart with joy to see the battle rifle be used again. But at the same time, I'm not opposed to the sidekick becoming the main weapon of choice for competitive play. At the end of the day, I want a fair, balanced game, and Halo 5 was proof that the Magnum can easily fill in the shoes for an arena-style setting. Regardless of what 343 chooses to be the starting weapon, it's important that all these factors that were mentioned are taken into account, and hopefully come later this summer, we can all have the chance to try out the weapons for ourselves and provide feedback. But until then, we just have to wait patiently. Before I go, I also want to give a huge shout out to Trunks, Eli X, and Eli the Ninja for giving me such valuable insight on the matter. They provided me with perspective and wisdom with the experience they've had playing these games and perfecting their craft in them. Please go check them out if you got the time. Thank you all for watching today's video. I hope you all take care, be safe, and have a great day. Much love. Oh yeah, and one more thing. Please make sure you are signed up for the insider flight tests. Head over to halowaypoint.com and make sure you are properly opted in for all the programs and that you have all your information up to date. 343 employees on Twitter have constantly been reminding us that there are a large number of people who have not properly updated their information. So make sure to check up on that. Alright, that's all.